This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Hannam.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, there's a lot of news to cover today. We're going to be covering how Israel bombed al-Nasser Hospital, the last fully functioning hospital, or I should say barely functioning hospital in Gaza, where it killed physicians, nurses, healthcare workers, as well as killing journalists and TV crews. It was a particularly gruesome attack. It was a double tap attack, which we'll discuss in detail later in the show. Reuters is now saying that it's no longer going to share the coordinates of its Gaza teams with Israel after so many journalists have been killed by the IDF. Now, is Reuters and other news media, are they complicit in the death of its journalists by sharing these coordinates, Jamal? We'll be talking about that. And according to the UN, over 1,000 attacks on Palestinians by Israelis in the West Bank have been recorded since January. That, in fact, may be an underestimate, with the recent report that Israel plans to completely, cut off the West Bank, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, from Ramallah and other parts by the largest settlement expansion in recent memory, illegal settlement expansion. Jamal will be covering that story. And Gaza's destruction is almost complete per satellite images, which show devastating consequences. And the last piece of news that we'll cover is that the largest academic group of genocide scholars in the world, Jamal, just published their report today that Israel is committing genocide. 2 years too late, but this is the largest genocide scholar organization in the world, and they have concluded that Israel is committing genocide. However, before we get to those stories, Jamal, we're going to talk about, despite the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the targeting of journalists, key European governments refuse to stop the flow of intelligence and arms and supplies to the Israeli military. Germany is among these. We're going to see an interview that you did with Dr. Jürgen Mackert. He's going to explain why he thinks this is a huge mistake. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Potsdam in Germany and is the author as well. It's a great interview, Jamal.
Yeah, let's watch the interview. Israel continues its carnage in Gaza. Recently, double-tap bombing on Nasser Hospital, where it followed its first strike with a second, aimed at killing rescue workers rushing to give aid. 5 of those killed were journalists. Meanwhile, increasing number of Palestinians, many of them children, are succumbing to death by starvation as Israel denies entry of necessary food and essentials. In addition to the United States, key European governments refuse to stop the flow of intelligence and arms supplies to the Israeli military. The only thing that would compel it to stop the genocide and arrive at a political solution. Germany is amongst these, but as a perpetrator of its own genocides in the 20th century, its complicity seems stupefying. However, it embodies the core of a pervasive ideology among Western modernity that justifies the exploitation and extermination of weaker cultures in the global hierarchy. In his recent article in the Middle East Eye, as Gaza becomes a death camp, German complicity reveals the West's racist biopolitics. Dr. Jürgen Mackert explains how this ideology designates who is entitled to life and resources and who is not. Jürgen Mackert is a professor of sociology at the University of Potsdam, Germany, and is an author as well. His most recent book is entitled On Social Closure, Theorizing Exclusion, Exploitation, and Elimination. Welcome to Arab Talk, Jürgen.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
In your recent article, you write that it is impossible for Germans to see images of Palestinians being starved to death by the Zionist settler colonial regime without being reminded of their own history. Babies and children reduced to skin and bones, women and men emaciated to the point of collapse, apathy in the eyes of the dying, the scenes from Gaza recalling those who were deliberately starved during the Nazi sieges of Leningrad and Stalingrad, in the Warsaw Ghetto, and in concentration camps. How is it that Germany will not recognize these atrocities when they are perpetrated on Palestinians?
I mean, there is a very important differentiation to make between Germans who, in growing numbers, I think, now realize what is going on in Gaza, and on the other hand, our political establishment, which tries everything to conceal what's going on. So as we grow up, all of us at school with images, pictures again and again on what happened during German fascism, Nazi time, we know these pictures of people being starved to death when the concentration camps were liberated. And so my impression is that people understand today, or now in Germany also, because they see the pictures for the very first time during a genocide, what is really going on. But we have this split in Germany about between the political establishment, and this is all parties in Germany, including the so-called leftists, and the population, especially young people who are on social media and see what is going on and reacts. Although there is a heavy repression in Germany against voices who demand an end to genocide and an end to settler colonialism in Palestine.
Talk about how the wholesale delegitimizing of Palestinians as an example of the categorizing worth and not worth, the unwillingness of Western media to value the reporting of Palestinian journalists, the buy into all of Israel's lies to defend itself as it commits one heinous act after another.
What I'm arguing in the article is that I think we cannot go on looking at Europe, or especially Germany, as a continent or a country which is based on values and norms, the so-called union of values. But we have to look a bit closer to the whole kind of how our societies are organized. And then we see that on the one hand, we have the settler colonial tradition and the colonial tradition in Europe. But at the same time, we have been a liberal civilization. Today we are a neoliberal civilization. And neoliberalism is not just an economic system. It is a very encompassing ideology and political program. And the interesting thing is that we are always told that the market is something universal, so that we can, wherever we are, just being participants in the market as consumers or producers. In fact, neoliberalism is based on a very clear idea of cultural superiority of the West. If you look at one of the founding fathers, August von Hayek, he deliberately said that the market can only operate on the foundations of Western civilization. So all the other cultures are seen as not able to reach this kind of cultural level to operate as market societies. So it's a Western project. And in this point that you argue that people are regarding to the value they have as economic actors are more worth or less worth, there is the same distinction in neoliberal ideology as we find it in settler colonialism. And this is the thing that I'm interested in. So where these two ideologies and political strategies connect and reinforce each other.
You also, in your article, take it way back to 1492. You talk about Germany's ongoing support for Israel and its refusal to acknowledge that it is committing a genocide. You connect this to a Western ideology about preserving white lives while condemning others to death since 1492. Maybe for our audience and viewers, you can just talk about the significance of this year.
Yeah, sure. As a sociologist, I was socialized as talking about modernity, and somehow modernity always seems to start maybe after the 30 Years' War in Europe, or maybe even later. But in my article, I'm following Mahmoud Mamdani, who is a professor at Columbia University, and in one of his recent books, he argues that we have to go much further back to understand modernity as a project. And then it's not the 17th, 18th, or 19th century when modernity begins, but it is 1492 because of two important events that happened. The one thing is that the Spanish king was ethnically cleansing the Iberian Peninsula. So Arab people and Jews had to leave the country, or they were killed, or some of them were allowed to become Catholic or Christian. So we have inside Europe a very important process of homogenizing the emerging nation in a very early state, of course. So this cultural homogeneity is important, for example, also if we try to understand today's debates about immigration and the so-called multicultural society. Western nation states and nation states in general are looking at their own nation, and this own nation is defined as, in cultural terms, a homogeneity, a homogeneous kind of community. So this is the one aspect. But in the same year, of course, as we all know, in 1492, Columbus sent by the same king and the Pope, was sent to discover new worlds, new territories to be colonized or taken for the crown and for the Pope. And so what happened as we know, in the Caribbean or in South America was the same process. It was ethnically cleansing, killing indigenous people, so taking the land from them, trying to get rid of them with any means possible. And so these two processes that we find on the one side in Europe, on the other side in the so-called New World, are the common starting point of a process that today we call Western modernity, which is characterized by efforts to minimize cultural heterogeneity, to make all these countries homogeneous, to distinguish clearly between who belongs to the nation and who does not belong to the nation. And so we have this very important differentiation between who we are and who the others are. And if you define the others in these terms, then you can almost do to them whatever you want, because they just simply don't belong to us, who are in the end cultural, more developed, more culturally developed as all the others. So if we talk about Western modernity, we have to go back to the 15th century and not start somewhere with the French Revolution or the industrialization or the Renaissance or whatever.
Right. The question that astounds people desperate to stop Israel's carnage is why Western governments are not abiding by international law and the rules-based order established after World War II and holding Israel accountable. There was distrust in the system and that governments would abide by it. However, you explain that below this veneer, there has always been a power dynamic of biopolitics organizing the West that is the true driving force. What is this vision of biopolitics?
Biopolitics is an idea or a concept that goes back to French philosopher Michel Foucault. And what he tried to argue, or what he argued, is that 200 years ago, we see that the classical idea of what it means to be a sovereign state changes dramatically. Until that time, sovereignty meant that the sovereign, whoever the sovereign was, decided about life and death. So he decided who is allowed to live and who has to die. 200 years ago, then this idea changed, and Foucault argues what replaced or partially replaced, we still have this idea, but partially replaced this classical idea of sovereignty is what he called biopolitics. And this changes the concept of what we knew about sovereignty, because he now argues that it's not longer to let live, but to make live, to make your own nation live with modern ideas of social policy, health systems, and so on. And on the other side, those who are left to die. So you don't take care of them anymore. You only concentrate on who is part of your own national community, society. You try to bring them up with population politics and so on, but you let the others simply die. They don't play any role. And we see this in many aspects today. If you look, for example, um, at the migration policies of the European Union and the European states, and you look that the Mediterranean has turned into a mass grave, usually you would think this is a moral impossibility. But if you think in Foucault's terms, you see that these people simply don't matter and they don't pose even a moral problem. To let them die in the Mediterranean is not a problem. They are responsible for what they do. So if they try to come and they don't manage, it's not our job or our duty to save them because they will be nothing but an economic burden, which is also not true, of course, but this is the way Western nations think about what is going on.
Would you also say that it is a concrete ideology that Western powers pursue, like you've mentioned neoliberalism, or is it something that is just understood among leaders implicitly?
I I'm not sure if I got your question correct. Could you repeat this again, please?
I'm just saying, would you say that it is a concrete ideology that Western powers pursue, like you mentioned, neoliberalism, or is it something that is just understood? I mean, is it just part of the elite that have this thinking, or is this something just amongst the masses?
Um, I actually I'm not so sure if our leaders really understand or have understood how deep neoliberal ideology goes into the fabric of a society. So whatever we hear from them is the ideology of the free market, which, as we know, does not exist. But neoliberalism has much more consequences, and powerful actors who push ahead with this kind of ideology, which is a very broad, um, let me say, very broad row of instruments how to organize society. So this is something I'm not really sure if Western leaders are totally aware of that. What they are aware of is then what comes out of the ideas of how to do politics. And if you always argue that behind all this is a quasi-natural process of market and marketization and the way people act as consumers and producers and nothing else, then you can go ahead with such a program. And the consequences then are the Mediterranean, they are Palestine, they are the concentration camps in Libya that the EU funds to keep migrants from the south of Africa far away from the European borders, and so on. And the masses, I think, the population, I don't think that people really are into discussing or thinking about neoliberalism. Somehow it happens to them. And this is something I also think in Western societies, this idea of being enlightened and being informed is just a myth. So people, I mean, they have to struggle in their daily lives, but the consequences for others, and then you see again this split, the consequences for others in many areas of society are not important actually. So people leave others for themselves.
When you write that for decades, the West has pursued neoliberal biopolitics, using Palestine as a testing ground to see how far it can go in the destruction of human beings. Are you talking about deliberately designed environments?
Actually, I think that Palestine has been for decades the area which has been used as understanding how to manage populations, how to react to resistance. And in this sense, Palestine has always been a testing ground for the Western nations. And I think it's a very important aspect of why they don't stop the genocide, but continue. It's not only testing weapons or new weapon systems or whatever they do, but it's also to know how you fight against people in their own houses, how you manage to push people out of certain spaces. And I think we see this, if you think now just about what happens in the US with Trump and so-called cleansing of Washington, D.C. from homeless people. This is not the same, of course, but the processes that we see, how to go ahead with taking superfluous populations that neoliberalism creates away from spaces where they should not be. And in this sense, I think that Palestine has been for a long time the place to see how you can exercise these politics, how you can go ahead, how you can use strategies, how you can move huge parts of people from one place to another. And in this sense, this is not a new thing. This is something we know since long time.
What is the significance of this in a post-colonial era? Because settler colonialism was rampant through the beginning of the 20th century. Are we entering a neo-colonial era?
I think this overlaps. I think if we look at African countries, we see a neo-colonial structure since long time. After decolonization, this emerged gradually, and we have neo-colonial dependencies from the global market and so on. But the period of settler colonialism actually never ended. Lorenzo Beragini, who is one of the most important people in this field of debate, he said there is no post settler colonialism as there is a kind of post-colonialism, because these processes of taking land, eliminating natives goes on and on and on, and we see that also in other areas of the globe, indigenous people are always under pressure from white societies, from westernized societies, from global capitalism, and so on. So they play no role. If there is any new pipeline to be built, their rights play no role. And the rights of Palestinians today play no role with regard to whatever you might think about.
Back to the attitude in Germany, there is, of course, there is a difference between public sentiment and government actions vis-a-vis Israel's aggression. For example, recent polls in the United States show that less than 36% of those polled want to see the United States continue providing military support to Israel. As for Germany, we keep seeing images on social media of heavy crackdowns on dissent by those who want Germany to end its military support for Israel. In the United States, people talk about the driving force behind the government, the military-industrial complex and AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobby groups. But what is the driving force behind Germany to remain? I mean, I'm talking the German government to support Israel unconditionally.
If you ask any politician, they of course would start to talk about immediately about the Holocaust and the responsibility of Germany for Israel, and then they start about talking the so-called reason of state and all these things. Actually, I think this is not the truth. It is just to veil interests in the region, geopolitical interests, but also interests with regard to keeping this Zionist settler colonial project alive. And I don't think that there is so much difference between who are the driving forces. In Germany, we have a massive Zionist lobby, which is very powerful, very connected to politicians in all parties. And you have also interests of the military-industrial complex. I think this is not a specificity of the US, but it's the main nation, of course. But These driving forces exist in Germany as well, but this is not discussed in public in Germany. So what we see is always this so-called guilt discourse, the special responsibility, and then if you look at what politicians really say, you see that this is not the fact and that there are other reasons lying behind, but which are not discussed, and not even in the media. I mean, there is not one media outlet, I'd say, that really questions all these positions that are formulated with regard to the special responsibility. So this is a very difficult situation in Germany for everybody who tries to speak out and to take position for Palestinians. And the driving forces, I think, are almost everywhere on the globe the same.
I mean, do you think there is a shift or a breaking point? Like now, the images are very clear, the numbers are very high, more than 60,000 Palestinians killed, 20,000 plus children were also killed, journalists are being targeted, healthcare workers are being targeted. I mean, Germans don't live in a vacuum. They see these images, they on TV, on social media, and you don't feel that there is a shift there in kind of political opinion or political stand?
I think it's the same split as we talked before. The population perception is changing dramatically, but not in the political establishment, not in the German elites. I mean, there is nothing you hear from German doctors, from any kind of the press, who take a position against the killing of their colleagues. There is nothing. We have an ethic council. It never mentioned a single word on the situation. So the whole elite and the politicians are somehow in a bubble. They just don't want to see what's going on, and there is a lot of sentiment that you are not allowed to talk, which is also very German, a very typical German idea that we have to be silent, we should not talk out, and that our government is doing the correct thing. But I really have to say, after 22 months of genocide, what else should happen? What should happen that the German politics changes, that German leftist politics, whatever this is. I think there is no left in Germany, but I'm sure that they will go with Israel until the end, whatever this end will be. Mm. There is no shift. There is nothing that would actually bring them to reason, somehow to understand what is going on. I mean, until today, it's only a few weeks ago that our chancellor said that Israel is still a democracy defending itself. Mm. Our last chancellor, he openly lied to have seen this Hamas video from 7th October 23, and they are all just going ahead. They don't worry. They don't see anything but this kind of wholehearted support for the Zionist settler colonial regime.
Has Israel's brazen genocide exposed the inadequacy of international law to curb and contain this biopolitical ideology of who is worthy of resources and who is not on the global stage? Or is there no double standard because it was always meant to serve the white populations?
Yeah, this is what I argued. We have a lot of discussions about double standards, especially in Germany with regard to Ukraine and regard to Palestine. But I think also that this debate is not really helpful, because if you go a bit deeper and you think about this biopolitical and the settler colonial tradition, then you see that there is not a double standard, but only one standard. The standard of the white West, who just is the gold standard for everything. And there is no second standard. It's just, as Foucault said, there are those who are allowed to live, who are worthy to live, and the rest is let die. And this is, I think, if you understand it this way, you see that this is not just a kind of looking at Ukraine and you're looking at Palestine, but it's clear from the beginning that there will be no support for Palestinians. The Zionists are the white settler colony from a European white settler colony, and they are the standard, not the Palestinians. And the same is with regard to Ukraine. There were so many programs to help Ukrainians, which I always found totally correct. But if you then see that there is nothing with regard to supporting Palestinians, bringing them out of Gaza, whatever you can think about, there is nothing. And this is not a standard. So you would need, what kind of standard should that be if you let people just die? And so I think actually, yes, it is like this. And this is also something that reminds us that settler colonial mentality has never ended. It is about the West. It is about white people. It is about a cultural homogeneity, which is somehow Christian, believing that it was never in any contact with Islam or other religions that were important for its own development, and so on. So this is actually, in my mind, it's just the one standard for the Western white people.
Jürgen Mackert, thank you for coming on Arab Talk, and thank you for your great insight and article.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That's the voice in the face of Dr. Jürgen Mackert. He's a professor at the University of Potsdam in Germany, basically calling out why the European Union continues to send arms to fund the genocide in Gaza. It's kind of an interesting thing that's going on globally right now, Jamal. You see some European countries condemning the genocide, but at the same time continuing to supply deadly weapons to further the genocide, and Germany is right up there.
Well, his focus is on Germany, and obviously he's from Germany. And he explains it because, the stereotype, at least what we hear, is that, at least at the surface, I shouldn't call it a stereotype, but at the surface, people say Germany because of the Holocaust and the guilt of the Holocaust, which plays a major role in basically looking the other way, when Israel commits its own, basically, genocide. But he discusses this and takes it even deeper than that. He talks about racism. He takes it all the way just to 1492 and the attitude of the entire, basically, Europe with when it comes to Islamophobia,
Right.
and so it's a very educational, I would say, interview. But also he discusses the current government and the reaction and why they're doing it, even though he talks about that there is a major difference between the attitude of the government and a lot of the people, in Germany, as we've been witnessing. If you watch TV or you watch on social media, almost on a daily basis, Germans demonstrate against the genocide, and then the German police brutally attacks the demonstrators. So it's an eye opener, and why Germany is important? Well, because it basically leads the European Union. Again, we cannot paint everything with a wide brush. The reaction in other countries is different. Spain is very pro-Palestinian.
Right. But Jamal, Germany does supply a lot of deadly weapons to Israel.
It does, and also it takes a major role, both politically and economically, in the EU. Moving on, just to the biggest tragedy of the week. I don't know if there is every week we say there is a huge tragic massacre or tragedy part of this genocide. When Israel bombed al-Nasr hospital, Israel knew that there were journalists. Israel knew that there were civilians. Israel knew that there were doctors and medics. So they struck the hospital, which is Nasr Hospital in the south of the Gaza Strip, killing at least 20 people, including 5 journalists who worked for Reuters, Associated Press, Al Jazeera, and others, major organizations. A cameraman, Hussam al-Masri, he was a Reuters contractor, was killed near a live broadcasting position operated by Reuters on the upper floor, just below the roof of the hospital in Khan Yunis in the initial strike. And what happened is very nasty, very dirty on the part of Israel. They bombed the hospital. The bombing was live streamed.
Right.
Rescue workers, as usual, rushed to the hospital to take care of those who were wounded. Bombed it again. After all the journalists and the rescue workers gathered, killing everybody basically.
Yeah.
And then we should name, they killed the journalist, including Mariam Abu Dakka, who's a freelance for the Associated Press and other outlets. Muhammad Salama, who worked for Al Jazeera. Muaz Abu Taha, a freelance journalist who worked with several news organizations, including Reuters, and Ahmed Abu Aziz, and a photographer, Hatem Khalid, also a Reuters contractor. And what I'm saying, I'm naming all these because a lot of them worked for Reuters. And, guess what? Israel said, no, we were only targeting a camera placed by Hamas,
Yeah. A camera.
positioned towards our troops. uh, and that's what we bombed. And then later on, after all the outcry, which I don't think it's enough outcry, he said he deeply regretted what he called a tragic mishap. Tragic mishap. I mean, how
Well, I get
disgusting is this? And how many times Israel has done that, where they said after they get caught. And the reason, by the way, the reason even he said that is because there was another camera not placed
that's
in
right.
the hospital itself, but from outside, focused on the hospital and focused on the rescue workers when they went there and when they were killed on live TV. The live feed that was going to Al Jazeera, that was going to Reuters, that was going to Associated Press on live TV, their employees were basically massacred in real time.
Yeah, Jamal, that's exactly right. And even the New York Times, which has failed in its journalistic mission to not just cover the genocide in Gaza, they failed to really step up and, say something loud and clear about the assassination, murder, and basically attacks on journalists. Even the New York Times published a report yesterday saying that their own independent investigation completely contradicts the Israeli narrative that it was a tragic mistake. I guess the Israeli narrative now, Jamal, is that the murder and the genocide of well over 62,000 men, women, and children, over 18,000 of whom are children, and the starvation of the entire population of Gaza is, quote, a tragic mistake. Yeah, it's complete rubbish, as we know. Israel continues to commit its genocide with impunity. No one is stopping them. The United States is giving the free rein, as we know about this. But, going back to our first segment and what we've been talking about, the large global opinion is really different from what these governments are doing to give the Israelis cover. No matter what France and the EU say about recognizing a Palestinian state, Jamal, the reality is the genocide is going forward. They're now talking about the Tony Blair plan, who visited the White House last week with Donald Trump, and the idea that they would somehow give Palestinians in Gaza the opportunity to leave. In other words, more ethnic cleansing, more forced displacement, more kind of extension of the genocide. These world leaders are complicit in this genocide right now, Jamal. And what happened at Nasser Hospital is just unbelievably depraved in terms of what the Israelis have done to healthcare workers and journalists. But I don't see any. I don't see it. I don't see the New York Times, the Washington. You hear a little outrage, within 24 hours. But what are they doing about it, Jamal? I mean, perhaps Reuters and these other news agencies, because they're sharing GPS coordinates with the Israeli military. Let me ask you: do you believe they're complicit?
Well, that's why I put this because there was a press release by Reuters and a news feed by them saying that they no longer will be sharing the coordinates of its Gaza teams with Israel. And I'm quoting here after so many journalists were killed in IDF strikes. So the question is, which is, this does not only apply to Reuters, applies to AP and probably to Al Jazeera and others. How many journalists have been killed? More than 250 journalists have been killed. Is this the first time that this happened? No, it's not the
No.
first time. It's not the second time. It's not the third time. So, as a responsible organization, and because this is news to me, like to me, I didn't know about it for sure that every time they had their journalists reporting from a certain point, they send their coordinates to the IDF.
Yeah.
They share
Yeah,
their,
they have
there's
to.
every single time they've
Yeah.
shared their coordinates to the IDF. Well, what does that tell you? It tells you that you're telling the IDF, here we are. This is where there's
Come and get
something
us.
important happening there. So why don't you bomb it in a way? So I don't want to point the finger, but there should be this should be questioned. This should be questioned because maybe it is a procedure that they follow. But then when your procedure causes the death of your journalist every time you do it, why do you continue doing it? And that's where I'm questioning that, and I think we should have they should have a hearing or I mean, I certainly, if I had a family member involved and got killed, I would sue AP and I would sue Reuters on their behalf because this is not the first time, and that's why I think there should be a debate about it. And yes, now they're changing their attitude, but after what? After
2 years.
250 journalists have been killed?
Yeah, I mean, Jamal, I think you make a very important point. The same thing goes with the medical personnel, by the way. All of the medical personnel who come in and out of Gaza, the agencies that supply and facilitate the bringing in of international healthcare workers are mandated to share the coordinates and cooperate with the IDF and COGAT whenever they do this. So it seems like journalists and healthcare workers, Jamal, are sitting ducks. I mean, they have the GPS coordinates of all of these important individuals given to the IDF. What's the IDF going to do? Of course, they're going to target them. Of course, they're going to target hospitals. Of course, they're going to target journalists. They don't want the world to know. But I think the larger issue is, where's the international journalistic community? Why are the big named journalists, news corporations not having a much larger outcry and denunciation of Israel during this time? I don't see it happening. And journalists are continuing to get murdered, Jamal. Palestinian journalists continue to get murdered.
Yeah, and my question again is this a standard practice? And
It
I'm not talking,
is.
yeah, but I'm not talking about Gaza. Is this a standard practice in every conflict? Do they do that in
I don't think
Ukraine?
so.
Do they do that in
No,
Ukraine and in
not
Russia?
that we know of. No, of
Did
course
they
not.
do that in World War II? Did they
No, of
do
course,
that in Vietnam? Did they
of
do
course
that?
not.
I mean, is this standard? You're basically going into a Palestinian territory and you're sharing your coordinates with their enemy. You're sharing your coordinates, or you're sharing the coordinates of your employees who happen to be Palestinians, by the way, because not a single foreign journalist have been allowed to go and reach these areas. You're putting their lives at risk, and you're sharing it with those who want to kill them. And I mean, how much evidence do you need more than 250 journalists being killed? How much evidence do you need that more than 60,000 Palestinians have been killed?
You don't need more evidence, but this goes to show you the coordination between governments and between news organizations who, I believe, I'm just going to say it, continue to be complicit in facilitating this genocide against Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, Jerusalem, against journalists, against healthcare workers, against doctors, nurses, everybody. There's a lot of complicity that will need to be analyzed and unpacked as we go forward. And as I said, Jamal, the largest genocide academic group in the world finally, after 2 years, has come out and said They believe that Israel is committing genocide. How many times do we have to say this? You have former Israeli prime ministers and generals saying Israel is committing genocide, yet they continue to do it.
So the UN has issued a report saying that over 1,000 attacks on Palestinians by
Yeah,
Israelis in the West Bank recorded this year since January. Just
right,
uh,
right,
we talk about the genocide, which Israel's surrogates deny and say, well, it's a war. Israel's trying to avoid killing civilians, and Hamas operates there. But in Gaza, and that's it. And I mean, but in the West Bank, there is no Hamas. Those are civilians. Yet,
exactly.
Israel keeps attacking them. Israeli settlers keep attacking them, unabetted, I have to say. They're setting their homes on fire, Palestinians' homes on fires. They're setting olive trees on fires. They're physically attacking and have killed Palestinians, including a Palestinian American. And right under the nose of the Israeli government, right under the nose of the United States Embassy, which few kilometers away from where these events happen, and yet we don't see any accountability, and they're just doing it because everyone is distracted with Gaza, and they're appropriating land on a daily basis. They're attacking churches in Taipei, which you're setting churches on fire, historical churches on fire,
Right.
and they're getting away with it.
Yeah, well, I think that's the overall kind of analysis that we continue to kind of articulate and kind of speak to, Jamal, because there's genocide in Gaza, active genocide and starvation of 2.2 million Palestinians, and with that comes not as much attention on what's happening in the West Bank and Jerusalem for Palestinians who continue to be attacked, who continue to be assaulted. I mean, you said, unchallenged by illegal colonial settlers, Israeli settlers, many of whom are Americans. And there's one other point that we need to, put out there. They often do it under the cover, if you will, of the Israeli military, who supports these illegal colonial settlers in killing, attacking, Palestinian civilians, uprooting and burning of olive trees, burning of villages, and as you said, burning of churches. Now, let me ask you a question. If churches were burned down any other place in the world, do you think there would be such silence? I mean, obviously not. I mean, we have this pattern and practice of Israel continuing to commit these atrocities in Gaza, West Bank, and Jerusalem, and they're literally getting away with murder. The West Bank situation is really, really terrible right now, Jamal. We haven't been giving it as much airtime as it really deserves, but with this approval by the Israeli Knesset of this huge settlement block in the West Bank, completely obliterating any connection between the North and the South parts of the West Bank, is really a catastrophic development, and I'm sure we're going to be covering it as time goes on.
Well, we know what is that going to be heading. Israel is going to. I'm not going to say will. Its plans to annex the West Bank. I mean, that's the whole
Functionally,
idea,
they have. Yeah,
and
functionally, they have.
appropriate as much land, as much Palestinian land, add more settlements, and they've been adding more settlements there. And that this is Gaza is giving that cover while they're working heavily on the West Bank. And of course, we've talked the last show we've talked about their great Israel expansion that Netanyahu aspires to have, which also includes part of Egypt and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and so forth. But at least for the time being, I don't know if that part is going to materialize now. But I think the West Bank is very close to that happening, basically, and unilaterally declaring it as part of Israel and
I think they're already there, Jamal. I really believe that functionally the West Bank, as you and I know, has already, I mean, in a pattern and a practice of illegal colonial settlements and the way they practice control and oppression of Palestinians in West Bank, Jerusalem, Jamal, it is functionally already annexed. I mean,
Well, yeah,
they
definitely. I mean, it's under control. I mean, we know
yeah,
Israel
and
controls,
the United
historic
States, again,
Palestine.
this is, and you know this, but just in the last 24 hours, the United States has stopped all visa applications for Palestinian passport holders, many of whom, by the way, are also American citizens. They're now completely cutting off all visa applications if you have a Palestinian passport to come back into the United States. I mean, it's the level of control, oppression, and destruction that's going on right now in the West Bank is again, it's slipping under the radar because we don't see any news organizations really speaking about these things. And except for our reporting and some of the reporting on social media by Palestinian journalists on the ground in the West Bank, we otherwise wouldn't be able to understand the depth of the oppression that's going on right now there.
That's right. And finally, Jess, I was looking at some satellite
Yeah,
imagery
devastating.
that
Devastating.
basically give you the reality on
It's devastating.
what's going on in Gaza, and it's amazing because um, it just I mean, we knew that this was happening, but this kind of gives you every
The visual.
single area and showing the amount of destructions. And I just want to read their findings, and this is based on satellite imagery. So it's not on hearsay or even from journalists on the ground. Journalists on the ground have been saying that Rafah is, for example, is totally destroyed. Well, this is what the satellite images show you, Jess. Rafah, 100% destroyed. Beit Hanun, 100% destroyed. Juhr al-Dik and Al-Muraga, 100% destroyed. Khan Yunis, 90% destroyed. Beit Lahia, 90% destroyed. Jabalia, 80% destroyed. East Gaza, 80% destroyed. Sheikh Ajlin, Al-Zahra, and Tal al-Hawa, 80% destroyed. West Gaza and Shati Camp, 40% destroyed. Nusayrat, 20% destroyed. Al-Burej, 30% destroyed. Al-Maghazi, 20% destroyed. Sorry, I'm taking this long. Deir al-Balah, 5% destroyed. And that's coming from satellite images. So it's really
Right.
the last, I would say, 6 or 7 areas are about 50% to 20% destroyed, but everything else is 80% to 100% destroyed.
That's right, Jamal. And you're giving those numbers as Israel and the military prepares to enter in Gaza, central Gaza, Gaza City, and completely lay waste. And they've already issued evacuation orders for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza who are already facing starvation, who already have been displaced multiple times. And they are preparing the next version of the genocide by going into Gaza City. So those numbers that you just described are certainly going to get worse.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll talk to you next week.
We'll see you next week.